Hi, my name is Janet Molbeck. I'm the executive director of Interweave. We're a small nonprofit here in New Jersey working to support spirituality for daily living, an integrated spirituality that nurtures wellness, the common good, and your spiritual life. Each year, we have a telethon. It's a way of keeping that work going. If you didn't have a chance to tune in, we hope you'll take advantage of this second opportunity. We want to thank you for supporting our work with 12 wonderful conversations about nurturing hope through prayer and practice, art and action. Thank you in advance for being there for Interweave and for the spiritual life in raising up the importance of hope. What we say here at Interweave is, let hope live in you. Thank you. Happy holiday. Hi, welcome to, I'm losing track of what hour it is. Boy, I'm gonna, Chris, do you know what hour it is?
We're in hour 7,
Hour 7 of our
halfway there.
12 hours of conversations. And thanks, Chris, for doing such a good job in guiding our technology today. It takes a village to run a virtual marathon, as you all are experiencing and are having these wonderful conversations. We're now going to welcome our a wonderful another colleague and friend, a dear colleague and friend, Todd Stockdale. Todd is a teaching fellow. Let me give you I'll say more wonderful things about you in a moment. We got to get the bio out of the way. A teaching fellow at Seton Hall University. Uh, I just like to say that you have your Ph.D. from the University of Edinburgh because it sounds so cool. And I love this about Todd. His focus in his study and his research and everything he does is about practical theology. God, I love that. Todd is a member of St. James Episcopal Church in New York City, and he is there, not surprisingly, he continues to form minds, adult formation, and some young people too, right, Todd?
That's
Yeah,
right. I do
that
a
teach
confirmation course with
confirmation.
13-year-olds.
Um, so he's a lifelong, well, I don't know that you're a lifelong. You're in my lifetime, you've been for some 20 something years, he's been an interweaver. He's been a board member. He is a core instructor. He does teach our ethical guideline. We have Guideposts is the course that we're in the middle of. And I'll just take a breath there and say thanks for joining us, Todd.
Well, thank you, Janet, for such a pleasure. Just being a part of this a little bit earlier today and now again this afternoon. It's amazing what you do, Janet. I don't know how I don't know how you go for 12 hours. Do you have an IV drip hooked up there and receiving fluids along the way?
Uh, Beloved Carl is bringing me fluids, so
Okay.
I give thanks for Carl, my husband and companion in life, and the spiritual journey, and philosophy, and interweave. So, but you are someone. Todd, I just do it because I hope that people will be, nobody. I said to Ben, you don't really remember the tele? I didn't get. Maybe he does remember a little bit of the Jerry Lewis marathon. So I hope that when I'm like on the floor, people will finally help us to get over the mark to get our goal. That's the idea of it.
I love it.
Also,
I love
it's
it.
also the fun of it. I mean, I am we're the privilege, using privilege in a, um, in a very positive way, of sharing 12 hours with 12 people whose instincts, wisdom, perspective I really enjoy. And you were one of them, Todd. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Janet. It's again always a privilege and a pleasure for me. So these I think might be the second and third time that I've been able to be a part, and it's always something I look forward to each year. Is it the fourth? Oh, Janet, is it the fourth time? Oh boy.
It's your fourth time. It's your fourth time.
Okay.
Um, and I love you'd have to know us and know our family to know that I consider it a break that Todd comes in the middle of the day and we're going to talk a little philosophy.
All right. I love that.
Um, so Todd, we're in the middle of this course and the topic of your hour is nurturing hope through the practice of the philosophy of pursuing truth. The turn of phrase, I'm sure, is not missed on anyone why that seems, well, we would have said you could have read that in any college or post college, university, textbook or symposium, pursuing truth. And it wouldn't have been like, well, yeah, they're going to talk about pursuing truth. But today, in today's world, that sounds like, oh, that's a provocative title. So with that introduction, knowing that we did talk about pursuing truth last year, the year before, it's just that now more than ever, it's important to talk about pursuing truth. Um, so Todd, you are a practical theologian, and we are in the middle of we have this guidepost course that you and I have constructed with the idea of can perhaps the Aristotelian, would it be correct in saying the Aristotelian philosophers?
Well, the Athenian philosophers of which Aristotle is one, yes.
Yes, the Athenian, thank you. I mean, it's going to get rough in as when I go in the Athenian philosophers. See, it's going to get talking is going to get harder and harder. Um, the big three:
Hmm.
Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who many people see them as foundational
They
to
are.
Western civilization, Western thought. Um, but I have to say, one thing that has been interesting is we have kind of a an interfaith mix in this class, and it's very one of the interesting things about pursuing truth, about philosophizing, about trying to understand the world, God, these big questions, is there is a place, and that's true of interspirituality as well. The deeper you go, the more you find commonalities in Eastern and Western or different, so nobody's saying, oh no, people are saying, oh, yeah, I see that too. So what do these old Athenian guys, what could they possibly have to offer us to help us to pursue truth and nurture hope in this crazy old world we seem to be living in?
Oh, Janet. This is, and
A
you
little
had
question. Just
a
a
small
question.
question, and I'll probably be able to handle that in about a minute and a half. So we'll have to figure out what we're going to do with the rest of our time. No, this is a huge question, Janet, and I'm so glad you mentioned the context that we're in this interfaith context with Interweave. These thinkers from Socrates, but even more so Plato and Aristotle, they have a huge impact on Western religious traditions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. It actually is our Islamic brothers and sisters who actually reintroduce this Western philosophical tradition to us in the Middle Ages, because particularly in the West of the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, as it begins to deteriorate, they're only studying and speaking Latin. And so they're cut off from the Greek thinkers. They're cut off from Aristotle and Plato and the works that they had written. And it's with through the engagement of Islam and Islam engaging with Western culture and in some ways rediscovering Aristotle particularly, but even Plato as well, covering these works that were in Greek, translated then into Arabic, and then from Arabic into Latin, that these philosophers get reintroduced to us in the Middle Ages. And so um, that becomes hugely influential, particularly in a European context, for the three traditions of Abrahamic traditions of Islam and Christianity and Judaism. And to kind of provide context for this conversation around pursuing truth and finding hope and nurturing hope, as you look at the context in which these three Athenian thinkers are operating in Athens, it's in some ways very similar to ours. It was quite a disruptive time in Athenian society. There were enormous amounts of cultural upheaval and political upheaval taking place, and so those questions of truth and what is true were in the foremost minds of these thinkers. So, for instance, in Athens at the time, there was a couple of things happening. One, you had around Socrates' day an influx of non-Athenian philosophers. They were called the Sophists. They were coming into Athens and they were plying their trade of philosophy in Athens. But their version of philosophy was not any real pursuit of what is true. They felt like persuasion or rhetoric was basically foundational to philosophy, and so they thought what the role of the philosopher was to basically be able to argue well. And again, there's certainly some value in rhetoric. There's certainly some value in the art of persuasion. But for the sophists, they were not concerned at all with pursuing what was true. They were just simply trying to be able through words and through argumentation, make their case. And truth could be then whatever you could argue for, and if you could out argue your opponent, that was their goal, and that was particularly important, or at least one side of what was taking place in Athens at the time, particularly important because Athens was coming into contact with other cultures through the Peloponnesian Wars and before that the Persian Wars. They were starting to kind of have this milieu of cultural diversity emerging, and so as you know, Janet, when different cultures sometimes come in contact with each other, the question of, well, what is true or what is just or what is right kind of it gets brought to the surface. And so the sophists, they basically just they punted that question of what was true or what was good or what was just or what was beautiful, and they just said, who could argue the best? And if we can argue the best, if we can be persuasive and convince in courts of law and in the political arena, convince our hearers of our case, that was what would win the day. And Socrates steps into that. Socrates and Plato step into that, and they try to argue for something perhaps a little bit different. That they start to starting with Socrates, turning to the words, turning to a dialectical argumentation where they start to say, well, how do people speak? And can we use human speech to try to come to some sort of understanding of a truth that is beyond or perhaps outside of just what can be argued? And so for again, Socrates, but Plato more specifically, they start saying maybe there is something out there that is true, and we have to search and, as you say, pursue with great effort. And we'll talk about the allegory of the cave in just a minute. We'll have to pursue with great effort, but perhaps through great effort and through this pursuit, we can arrive at something that is good, something that is beautiful, something that is true, that is beyond just one's ability to persuade or one's ability to use rhetoric to influence. So they they are and Janet, you know this. It's going to cost Socrates his life. That is something that really is out. It's profound it's outstanding to me to think of someone who's willing to die for the truth. That Socrates was willing to basically give his life as he was executed in this pursuit of what was true. And that's again, if you can imagine, where we are today and how disruptive we feel like things perhaps are, we can map that over the Athenian society, circa 400 BCE, and see the same things happening there, where there's these debates that are taking place around what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, and people losing their lives as a result. Interesting. Aristotle was also um, going to find himself in trouble in Athens again. And he's going to, rather than Socrates, who followed through with his execution and was allowed himself to be executed by the state, he chose to go into exile and flee Athens because he said he didn't want Athens to be guilty of a second crime against philosophy, believing that Socrates, in his execution, made Athens guilty of criminality against philosophy or betraying philosophy because they all loved Athens. They didn't want Aristotle particularly did not want Athens to be guilty again of that crime against philosophy. So he did choose to go into exile rather than be executed. So we think today that what we're dealing with is as far as our current cultural milieu is difficult. They were dealing with it as well, and it was costly.
Um, we've been having these wonderful conversations, and I do think it is helpful for us to put ourselves in the context of history and not as if we're, not behave as if we're outside of the course of history, as it will, that we're part of um, a larger, a larger journey, a larger struggle. Um, so I, I want to ask the question because as you were talking, is there, you know, again, we talk a lot about Socratic method in my household. Is there a way, because we know we're living in a world that there was a slant on truth. Truth has been marketed, slanted, um, branded, um, to the point that it's difficult. I look forward to the recreation in the coming years of what is our version of radio free world. Radio free. Remember Radio Free Europe during World War
Yes.
II? There was a lot of propaganda. How will we get to truth, to get to a shared truth together? And so I'm wondering, are there some key tools in dialectic conversations, dialogues that we can learn from so that we can have a conversation with someone that can make it possible to cover truth. I mean, we're just talking with Ben about alien beings. I think sometimes you're engaging with somebody from another culture, for example, and you really, their roof may be your floor. I know that you really have to um, let go of assumptions
Hmm.
to enter into somebody's reality. So, that being said, are there some um, guide guideposts, guidelines that we can learn from these men that Socrates walked around and talked and listened. He practiced Socratic, what afterwards was called Socratic method,
Yes.
to learn, to uncover the truth. Are there some tips? I'm going to say tips that what learnings are there for us about how we can try to uncover truth?
That is an outstanding question, Janet, and I think we can start with Socrates as you have and look at kind of his method. One of the things that we can appreciate about Socrates, and again, it's going to um, upset his interlocutors and frustrate them, but he would not let this go. He would not let this pursuit of truth go, and he would do so through this dialogue. And so he was, depending on how you read him, he was very generous with his interlocutors in the sense that he would take what they said and he said, well, let's look at that and let's follow up on that. So I think of, for instance, a dialogue that he has with Euthyphro. Euthyphro was was a priest during Socrates' day, and Euthyphro was quite confident that he knew what was true about piety and about kind of religious devotion. And Euthyphro was deeply convinced of this, and was so convinced that he was knowledgeable of the pious and the just, that he was willing to go to great extremes. For instance, he was prosecuting his father for a murder that was probably more akin to what we would call manslaughter. And so he was going to actually prosecute his father because he felt like that was the pious or the devout thing to do. And so Socrates just started to question him and just started to say, well, what do you mean by piety? What is your understanding of that word pious? And what's your definition of piety? How can you help me see what you see as being? And when Euthyphro would respond, Socrates says, well, let's take that a little bit further. And he was, through this dialogue, able to have this conversation with Euthyphro to really kind of, in some ways, expose the inadequacies of Euthyphro's understanding, and to expose to Euthyphro that he didn't quite grasp the pious in the way he thought he did. What happened to that dialogue, it's very interesting, is it tends to go sometimes in circles, and Euthyphro picked up on that and even named that, saying, Socrates, well, you never seem to want to stay put in letting me land anywhere. But it's because Euthyphro himself couldn't articulate an understanding of the devout or the pious or the just. And so Socrates was patient with that and was continuing to ask questions about what Euthyphro meant by that, pious. So I'm thinking in our context, Janet, right? You said, you mentioned kind of for some, floor is ceiling and ceiling is floor. What Socrates does is like, well, let's look at the language we're using. When you say this, what by that? Help me understand that. Help me understand your definition, your understanding of the good. You can look at this in the political world we live in today, in the United States. If we want to look at partisan politics, for instance, I do believe, the political parties are seeking the good. They want the good. But when you actually start to ask, well, what do you think is good? You're going to find that they have needs of the good. And so really, through that dialogue, and hopefully it can be done in a productive way. Through that dialogue, you can actually see if there can be something that's uncovered. For Socrates, the idea is there has to be something that lies beyond just our actions, but there actually has to be a good that is more universal, that we can point to. And so, by pursuing these questions of, well, what do you mean? We want the country? We want the common good, that we share here. Well, what do we mean by good? And question that, and you start to kind of pursue that. So that would be something we could learn from Socrates. This idea of dialogue, that the opportunity to enter into conversation with one another, that does require a bit of a generous exchange. Euthyphro and Socrates were friends, even though they did not see eye to eye on the pious or the just or the good, or at least they couldn't come to an agreement of that in their dialogue. They were friends. So that might be something too that's important, particularly as we think about conversations we have with those we know and love. Um, but then Socrates' student Plato, and then I'll say this about Plato's student Aristotle. The fascinating thing is, Plato does something over time. He is very loyal to Socrates, and he's very generous to Socrates, but he's going to start developing his own ideas that take Socrates' work and goes further with it. Aristotle, interestingly, is going to actually disagree quite a bit with his teacher Plato. And so they model for us in some ways this idea of the ability to both honor those we learn from and honor those whose ideas we respect, but not always having to agree. Aristotle disagrees with Plato on, for instance, the idea of the forms. Platonic forms are something that is out there. It's something that is above and beyond the world of the physical, or the world of the material, or the world of the senses. Aristotle wants to put those right in our world, and again, for us that might make little difference, but for those philosophers that was a huge difference. And so they had these differences, but there was still this respect for those ideas, that they were building upon the ideas of their mentors or their teachers. Plato, going from Socrates to Plato is, through his allegory of the cave, going to show us just how difficult it is in what we might call society to come to know the good, to come to know the truth, and to come to know the beautiful. And so he tells his allegory, Janet. We looked at that in our last time together in our Guidepost course with his allegory of the cave. And his allegory is going to kind of, through a story, give his philosophy of how we come to know and how we come to know the truth and the pursuit of the truth. And do you want to talk about the allegory now, Janet? Would that be a good time to talk about it, or
Well, sure. I think it's sort of related to the question that I was going to sneak in, and so I'll say it before. I think it'll lead in. Um, and there's kind of a hubris to thinking you own the truth.
yes, yes, yes,
Um, and if I want to learn, then I kind of have to relinquish
yes.
that hubris in order to get smarter.
Janet,
Um,
can I say something? Can I say something that is an excellent reminder. That is an excellent reminder. I want to go back to Socrates because you mentioned Socrates and the Socratic method. Socrates is famous for saying he knows that he does not know. And that is that's kind of his whole apology, his whole defense when he was brought before the Athenian courts and on trial for his life. His whole defense was, I know that I don't know. That is why I continue to pursue the truth. That is why I continue to ask questions. That is why I engage with people like Euthyphro and Meletus and others. I engage because I'm in this pursuit of truth. And you're exactly right. There is this, in some ways, this Socratic humility where he says, and he does think that he is wiser than the people who are certain that they know. And that's one of his critiques of Euthyphro, even his friend. He says, Euthyphro, you are very certain. You're very certain that you know what is pious. I'm not so certain. And so that's why I'm going to keep asking these questions. And so, Janet, that is a great point to bring up, particularly in these more fraught conversations we might be experiencing today, where there seems to be a lot of confidence on both sides, of debates on who knows what is true or good or beautiful or right or just. Socrates steps into that and he says, I don't know. And I know that I don't know. And therefore, I'm going to continue to ask questions. I'm going to continue to examine. So thank you for bringing that up, Janet. That's a great just asterisk to put next to the Socratic method.
it's interesting to think then that instead of that being a stressor that we don't know, that it
Mhm.
might be actually a relief. I don't know.
I,
I don't know.
I'm so glad you said that, Janet. And this is just going to be maybe turn it into a bit of a pastoral conversation. But for me, particularly as a university professor, I felt an enormous amount of pressure to know things. And there is so much liberation. There is so much liberation in being able to say, I don't know. I don't know. And that seems to be counterintuitive that it would make me feel like a fraud as an academic. But in fact, it's quite liberating. And I have colleagues and mentors that I look up to, both these colleagues and mentors I look up to. And when I watch them say that, I'm currently co-teaching with a philosopher who's deeply trained, much more deeply than I am, deeply trained in this, and it's so inspiring to see that colleague in the middle of class when a student asks a question say, "I don't know," or when he's explaining a text saying, "This is what I think, but I can't be certain." And it's just that humility that you talked about. It is quite liberating, and Socrates models that for us. Socrates models that for us.
And in a big world, this
Mm.
is important. So let's go to the cave from here. Let's go to the cave. Talk to me about the cave. What do we learn? And most people, if they reach back in their minds, um, will remember the cave story.
That's right, Janet. As I begin to talk about this, I think almost any undergraduate curriculum that the person would have gone through would probably have them at some point in their coursework encountering the allegory of the cave. It's probably one of the most famous Platonic works. It's in his Republic, and so it's a Socratic dialogue. So Socrates is the speaker, but we actually think these are more of Plato's ideas. Um, And it basically is in the context of trying to talk about the ordering of the state and the just ordering of society. He basically is trying to explain, and even Socrates in explaining this in the allegory, saying, I, I'm going to do my best to explain this, but again, that humility that you talked about, he's saying, there's an uncertainty there. And so we're going to try to get close to it, but it's going to be difficult. And so he employs an allegory. He employs an allegory to kind of help of the argument that he's making. And the allegory of the cave, it's a short piece. It's in some ways very simple. But as you begin to go deeper into the interpretation of the allegory, it can be mind-blowing. But we're asked to imagine prisoners that are born in the context of a cave. And they have been in that cave their entire life. And they're not just in the cave, but they're actually chained in the cave, and they're facing the cave wall. They're facing the back of the cave, and they're facing the cave wall. And they're not able to move to the left or the right. They can only see the wall in front of them. Behind them, there is a fire that's burning, that's basically casting light into the cave and casting shadows up on the cave wall. So they can see, obviously, the shadows of themselves up on the cave wall. But there's also other people who are in the cave behind them who have statues of animals and statues of artifacts and people, almost, if you could imagine, like puppets. That might be a way for us to think about it. They have these figurines, these puppets, and they're basically parading them behind the prisoners, in between the fire and the prisoners. So those two are casting shadows on the cave wall. So the prisoners, their entire life, are in this cave thinking that this is what the world is. And they're looking at shadows of themselves. They're looking at shadows of these figurines of animals and vessels and humans. And they're seeing those shadows across the cave wall. And they think this is what reality is. This is what is real. This is what is true. Um, and we know, um, I'm going to go ahead and begin some interpretive work with the allegory. We know that shadows can distort reality, right? So shadows are flat, they're two-dimensional, they don't provide any kind of color. There's no real context with these shadows because if you can imagine the pieces that are passing behind them, it might be a statue of a giraffe, followed by a statue of a monkey, followed by a statue of a bear, followed by a statue of a fish. They're completely decontextualized, and distorted. And even themselves, even as they look at themselves and their shadows and they think that's who they are, they're a distortion of themselves. So you have what we would call a distorted reality out in front of them. Um, the allegory, the story goes that the prisoners in the cave, they're looking at these shadows passing by, and they're naming the shadows, just as we would name the reality that we see. Janet, I'm seeing my internet's unstable. Did I drop out there a little bit?
Oh, yeah, I'm hearing you.
Okay, good. Um, they're seeing these shadows pass by, and they're naming the animals just as we name the things that we see in our realities. Um, the prisoners have someone who comes in and releases one of them. So one of the prisoners is released, and once she's released, she is able to get up from her chains and to turn around. Plato talks about the pain that this causes the prisoner because the prisoner has never, used her neck, she's never used her legs. And so there's this great pain that the prisoner experiences in having to stand up and to turn around. Furthermore, when she turns around and she sees the fire, the light of the fire, as you can imagine, it hurts her eyes, right? It hurts her eyes because this bright light is penetrating her eyes, and so it's painful in that regard as well. Then she begins to see these statues, and the statues don't make any sense to her because she's only known shadows. She's only known the shadows of the statues. And what the person who released the prisoner has to do is that person has to point to the statues and say, okay, this is a statue of a giraffe, and this is the giraffe that you see. And the prisoner goes through that process of back and forth and finally realizing, oh, I can now make sense of my reality and see that what I thought was real, what I thought was true, was actually just a shadow or a distortion of what is true that is behind me. That statue of a giraffe, that statue of a monkey, that statue of a bear. So that's step one. But as we know, because we're outside the story and listening, you're not actually you're just getting closer to what's real. You're still looking at statues or images of giraffes and bears and monkeys. And so there has to be this transition out of the cave. And so the prisoner is dragged out of the cave. And the text, many translations will say the prisoner is reluctantly dragged out of the cave. That basically, as you can imagine, Janet, your whole world is melting before your eyes, right? Your whole reality of what you have known your entire life is melting before your eyes. And you've just now had, kind of the veil lifted, as it were, and seeing that what you thought was real was only a shadow of what was real. But even then, that's not really real. It's just a statue. And so the prisoner is dragged out of the cave reluctantly into the outside world. And the same experience. Our prisoner, she is blinded by the light outside the world, unable to see. So she has to do what she knows, and that is look back down at the ground and see those shadows, see the shadow of herself, see the shadow of a bear, see the shadow of a monkey, and is able to kind of piece together a new reality outside the cave by starting with the shadows, then moving to reflections. Plato talks about looking at reflections in the water, and seeing herself in the water, reflection and a reflection of the things in the water. And eventually, as her eyes begin to adjust to the outside world, she's able to see the things. She's able to see the bear. She's able to see the monkey. She's able to see the giraffe, the true reality, the true things. Eventually, our prisoner that is released, she'll start to see the sky, and it'll first be at night that she's able to see the stars and the moon, but eventually see the sun in the sky. And the sun is the final thing that our prisoner sees. And it Plato says with great effort the prisoner can look at the sun. And we know this, right? It's not easy to look at the sun. It's something you kind of have to squint and maybe kind of, form a little shade in your eyes to finally look at the sun. Represent the good. The sun in the allegory represents what is good, what is beautiful, what is true, and what gives meaning to everything. And the prisoner begins to reason, and she begins to say, okay, the sun is the reason for the existence of everything. The sun is what gives life to the world and gives the possibility of life for the animals. The sun is not only what gives life and purpose and meaning to the seasons and time, but also it is what allows us to see, right? That's the interesting thing about the sun. And not only is the source of life, the source of what is real, the source of what is true, but it is actually what even allows us to see that which is true, that which is real, and begins to reason. And for Plato, the sun is the idea of the good, or the true, or the just, or the beautiful. Um, the prisoner then outside the cave, we think that's where the story could end, but begins to find that she pities the prisoners who are left down in the cave, right? That, as you can imagine, it's like, wow, I have these friends back down there who are looking at shadows of images or shadows of statues, thinking that's real, thinking that's true. I need to go back in there and explain to them that what they're seeing is a distortion of an image of what is real. But the problem our prisoner has is she goes back down into the cave. And when she goes back into the cave, just as you and I would if we go from a brightly lit space into a dark room, the eyes are not adjusted and she cannot see. So she goes into the cave and she's not able to see. And when she goes back into the cave and is not able to see, she's trying to explain to the prisoners that what they're seeing is a distortion. The shadow that you're calling bear is a distortion of a statue of a bear that is an image of what is really a bear outside that world. And because the prisoners have, one, no grasp of anything she's explaining that is behind them or outside the cave, and because her eyes are not well adjusted, she's not able to easily spot a bear, and tell the difference between a bear and a giraffe and a monkey. They think she's lost her mind. They think she's crazy. They think she was with us and she could see things like we saw them, and they were true to all of us. And now she's left and come back, and she can't see the same things we're seeing, and she's talking some nonsense about a world outside that is more real, more true. And they make the conclusion that basically, if someone comes along and tries to free any of us and puts us in the same state as she's in, we ought to kill that person. And that's a little bit of a nod or gesture to what happened to Socrates, because Socrates, for Plato, was trying to enlighten and get Athens to see what was true, what was good, what was beautiful, and the Athenians, executed him as a result. So the point of the cave, and this is where we enter into Platonic thought. The point of the cave is that the world we live in, the world of the senses, the world we see, the world we operate in is the cave. And his argument is that you and I are living currently in the cave. That you and I were born here, Janet. You and I live our whole lives thinking that this is real, thinking this is true, thinking that the things we call justice, the things we call right, the things we call good, are in fact those things. What Plato wants to argue is those things that we see in our world that we call just or good or beautiful are actually just shadows and distorted shadows of images of what is really good, what is really true, what is really just. And the effort that requires and the pain that requires for someone to go from shadows and distortions of the good or the true to images of the true to actually seeing what is true is quite painful. It takes an enormous amount of effort. And once you reach that, it's hard to explain it to those who've only seen shadows. And you're likely not to have a lot of success. At least Socrates did not always have success, and Plato is again giving a bit of a nod to his mentor Socrates in that. But I guess, in response to your question with the allegory, this pursuit of the truth, it is possible, and that's where the hope is. It is possible for Plato. We can do that, but it is with great effort, and it takes instruction, and it takes guidance, and it takes the hand of someone who's been there before to take us along. Um, we can do an analysis of the cave, Janet. It's really interesting. Media studies works with the cave, and I'm not just talking about news media. I'm talking about any kind of media. But any kind of media is a distortion. It's like a cave wall, right? It's like a distortion of the real.
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
we turn on the news at night, and we think we're getting access to the world, but we're not. We're getting a
And a
portion of the world.
production, like
Yes.
just like the puppets on the screen. And it's interesting. I always tell people, uh, and I think this is true of a lot of channels that sometimes I watch Univision, like Spanish television, and I see a lot. I see a wider lens of the world, whereas any, and I'll go to the basic channels, the not before we were in cable, and there were these big news channels, fire in the Bronx, and meanwhile war has sprung out in some country that if I went to Spanish television, and I'm sure that's true of a lot of more international television, tends to tell a global story, a wider story. Um, I want to share with you something we were talking about the other day, and because we don't have that much time, and our time is precious. Probably you're the guest that I would share this with. Um, the I said to you, I find it hopeful in a world where we're trying to pursue hope, the story of this young man who killed the CEO. And that may sound very peculiar to people, that I find this a hopeful story. And the reason I find it a hopeful story is because for me, that was a cave moment,
Mhm.
because I thought to myself, this is not about politics. This is about a world we're living in where truth is so distorted that we're applauding for a murderer.
Mhm.
Those are just the facts.
Mhm.
And I have no idea what the politics of people are who are applauding the murder of someone, because there could never be a justification for that. It tells me that that something is wrong with the world. So there's like a little bit of a sickness in the water, and a kind of like almost like a coliseum like environment where it's like meat to the lions, out with the um and I think that's because we are removed somehow from the humanity of things that it's not, this person must not be real to us, that we could rejoice in evil, that we could rejoice in evil. So I wonder what your thoughts about that, putting that up against the cave.
Right, Janet. I'm so glad you brought that up. It is such an interesting story, and it's captivated, of course, the entire country. And you're right. It's interesting to see the different responses to this. Um, I you know, I do think that what you're describing as far as the cave, Plato would say that's what we're experiencing. So we're experiencing something like a cave-like moment, as you said, Janet, and uh, we have all kind of been in that cave, and we're getting a distortion of what is true. You're getting a flat image. So, for instance, this CEO, right? Um, there's a very flat image and a distorted image of that CEO who was murdered. His humanity's lost, right? His humanity's lost.
Sure.
That he was just this representation of the ills and the evils of insurance companies, and he was that personified, and he was a flat portrayal of that, and that's all he was. There's not consideration of him being either a brother or a father or a husband. Like there's no
No
humanity there. There's
story
no
there. No
yeah,
story.
and exactly. And so there's that sense in which it is that decontextualized that that's what you were talking about with the news, only getting a small window, a decontextualized presentation where it's flat. And in that context, when it is a flat, distorted dimension of a human being and not a full human being, it's easy to imagine yourself saying, "Oh yes, let's applaud that action of a taking of a life in that manner." Um,
Yeah,
and
and
and that's
obviously I don't applaud this moment, but I take hope in that the problem is, so in a way that the problem is bigger
mhm,
and than a political problem. It's a
that's
bigger
right.
problem. And when we understand that it's a bigger problem, then we can maybe get to the bigger truth.
That is. Jen, I want to say something. You're reminding me of something we didn't plan on discussing today, but what you're describing there reminds me of Dr. King and his I've been to the mountaintop speech, his final public address before he actually delivered on the night before his execute or before his assassination. Um, he tells this story. He says, if God allowed me to live at any point in history, where would I want to live? And he kind of recounts, Western history, but he kind of, says, would I want to go back and see the slaves being liberated from Egypt? Would I want to go back and see, meet Plato and Socrates? Would I want to go back and be a part of the Reformation in Europe? I mean, he's in a Baptist context, so he's in Reformation in Europe. Would I want to go back and see the emancipation of the slaves with Abraham Lincoln? And he says, if God allowed me to kind of survey history, he says, I would want to see that, but I wouldn't want to stop. I want to keep going. I wouldn't want to stop. I want to keep going. He says, if God allowed me to live at any point in history, he said, I would want to live right now. I'd want to live in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. And he says that's a curious place to want to live because it was a very dark time, particularly in the civil rights struggle that he was a part of. It was a very dark time in our nation's history. We say, I will want to live right now. He says because it's in the darkness, it's in those dark times that you're able to see the stars. Like it's at night that you're able to see the stars. And for him, the stars was the just, was the true, was the good and beautiful. And so what you're describing there reminds me of that, Janet. It's like when you see something that is just seemingly so um, where we are out of place, it illuminates and allows us to see the just and the good so much more clearly. To see those stars, and that can give us hope for sure.
You see why you come back every year to talk about this? Because we only skim the surface, my
I know
friend.
we do, right?
Only every year we only skim the surface. Todd, I'm going to ask you the question that I've asked all my panelists. Where is hope for you? Where do you see hope? Before you go, tell us one thing that's giving you hope.
I find hope, Janet, in relationships, and I find it in my interactions with people. I think, uh, going back to the cave, if all I have when I encounter humanity is what is presented to me on TV screens and in news reports, I get a very flat and distorted perspective. When I actually encounter human beings and we sit down and we have coffee together, or we spend time together, I find that within the hearts of my fellow co-travelers here on this planet we call Earth, I find goodness. I find genuine goodness. I find genuine care. I find concern. I find people who love. I find people who are trying to do the good, trying to do what's right. And just like Socrates encounters with Euthyphro, we can all be misguided. We can all be certain in our understanding of what's true and be wrong. But I find people who are genuinely and authentically trying to live well.
Todd, thank you for joining us for this hour and helping us to see how we can nurture hope through the practice of the philosophy of pursuing truth. Truth, you are a true wisdom teacher because of what I see in you, Todd,
Yeah.
humility, goodness, and truth.
Oh, thank you, Janet.
Thank you
Thank you.
for
Pleasure to be a part.
thank you. All right. Thank you, Todd. And we say goodbye to Todd, and we are